presentation will be recorded and played by Greg, and then ending with Mark Anna. So without further ado, give people as much time, I'm turning it over to Jodi Short. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Sarosh. Can everyone see slides? Is everything up okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so this project starts from the theoretical instinct that labor activism is a form of private politics, but that the literatures on labor activism and private politics have not done a whole lot of talking to one another, a great paper of Mark's aside. But part of the project is to take some of the concepts that come out of the private politics literature and use them to help us understand the successes and limitations of labor activism. We also think labor activism is a great site for studying private politics, and that can really contribute to and advance concepts in that literature. So the motivating question in private politics research is, without seeking the state as a mediator, when are social movement activists, a relatively powerless community of individuals, able to influence managers to change their policies and practices? The answer in the existing private politics literature tends to cluster around this concept of the corporate opportunity structure. So the focus of the corporate opportunity structure is on how companies' weaknesses and vulnerabilities create openings or opportunities for social activists to kind of weasel their way in, right? And try and start working change. And I mean, that's fine so far as it goes, but it's really very movement centric. And we have a number of problems with this conventional account. I'm going to focus on one, but we can talk about more in the Q&A. But I mean, it base this idea that what activists should be looking for is organizational vulnerability. It's really a double-edged sword. On one hand, organizational vulnerabilities can create openings for activists to disrupt target firm operations. On the other hand, firms that have organizational vulnerabilities, at the end of the day, might not be capable of implementing the change that activists want. And so the main project that is at work here for us is to kind of shift the focus in the literature from this idea of the corporate opportunity structure and organizational vulnerability to what we call the corporate action structure or organizational capacity. We're really interested in under what conditions do organizations actually implement the change that activists are looking for. So a key aspect of organizational capacity, obviously there are many dimensions to this, but we focus on the capacity to reconfigure organizational resources. This capacity is particularly important for firm responses to activism, because by definition, activists are asking firms to change, and change requires firms to move resources around. So, so the paper is really built around our hypotheses about which organizational characteristics are likely to facilitate this resource reconfiguration in response to activist demands. The other thing that I think that this perspective really helps us to do is to hone in on potential trade-offs. So we're very interested in questions about whether resource reconfiguration entails trade-offs. I mean, it's certainly possible that responses to activism are win-win. That's great. But we also want to know whether some organizational priorities lose out when resources are shifted to satisfy activist demands. And we're particularly interested in whether those resource shifts might cannibalize some other priorities that activists might have. Okay, so our empirical context is supplier factories' responses to worker activism demanding better wages and benefits. The bulk of our data come from two sources. To measure factories' responses, we use proprietary data from a social auditor. To measure the labor activism activity, we use data from the China Labor Bulletin, which contains, as many of you know, detailed information on publicly reported workers' collective actions, such as strikes, sit-ins, protests in mainland China dating back to 2011. As you can see, our sample runs from 2012 to 2015. So this is the time frame we're working in. And we can talk in more detail about data if you wish. I want to keep moving along to get to our hypotheses and results. But before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about the key variables in our model. So we have two different dependent variables that are measuring different dimensions in factories' performance since a prior audit in two different categories: wages and benefits and occupational health and safety standards. Our first dependent variable is improvement in wages and benefits compliance between successive audits. The second dependent variable tries to capture a performance gap and looks at the extent to which a factory's performance gap between wages and benefits and health and safety widens or narrows between successive audits. So this is the variable we're using to get at the question of trade-offs. Our key independent variables are worker activism levels in a factory's city between the prior and focal audits, whether the factory uses a piece rate payment system, whether the factory is unionized. And then we have a suite of extensive controls at the city level, the factory level, and the audit level that, again, we'd be happy to talk about if there are questions. So our first hypothesis just kind of asks the general question: do factories respond to worker activism for wages and benefits? And we hypothesize that they will respond by improving compensation, based largely on the fact that activities like strikes, protests, and sit-ins threaten to disrupt production and cause economic loss. Now, it's, as many of you might have seen on the data slide, we don't have any evidence that any of the factories in our data set were explicit targets of activism, but we believe that broad-based worker activism within a geographic region can trigger field-level changes, even in firms that are not being directly targeted, because these firms are drawing from a common labor pool, and there's a risk that this activism might spread to workers at other factories in that pool. And indeed, we validate this hypothesis. We find that factories in cities with more worker activism demanding better compensation exhibit more wage and benefit improvement than factories in cities with less such activism. And I guess let me just give you a detail about it. So in our data set, all of the activism that we observe in the cities where our factories are located is related to wages and benefits. There's some variation, but something like 80% of the entire data set is activism for wages and benefits, and 100% of the strikes in our data set are for wages and benefits. So that's kind of that's the message that the worker activism is sending to companies. And when that message is sent at higher levels, then companies respond by exhibiting better, more improvement in wage and benefit compliance. Our second hypothesis is about the trade-offs, whether there are trade-offs between compensation and occupational health and safety. And we hypothesize that factories will trade off improvements in compensation for backsliding in occupational health and safety. Our reasoning is that supplier factory resources are highly constrained, occupational health and safety compliance is very expensive, and workers, there's a lot of research suggesting that workers in supplier countries tend to prioritize wages and benefits over health and safety. And indeed, we find that factories in cities with more worker activism demanding better compensation exhibit a greater increase in the performance gap between their wages and benefits scores and their health and safety scores than factories in cities with less such activism. Now, moving to this idea of the corporate action structure, we look at a couple of internal organizational structures that we think might influence the extent to which those main effects are occurring. So the first is whether a factory uses piece rate payment. So our third hypothesis is that piece rate payment factories the piece rate payment will facilitate, the use of a piece rate payment system will facilitate the implementation of activists' demands for compensation. Piece rate payment systems are, they're trivially simple in a lot of ways, right? And so they facilitate compensation adjustment based on cost per unit, and they give management tight control over financial resources, and thus a greater ability to meet workers' demands if they so choose. We think that there is going to be, kind of a different effect in terms of trade-offs. I mean, I guess this is the same directional effect, right? We believe that piece rate payment systems are going to exacerbate the trade-offs between compensation and OHS. And our reasoning is that managers at piece rate factories placed a high priority on health and safety measures generally because they impede high productivity goals. And piece rate paid workers also are less likely to resist such a shift because they place a lower priority on measures that might impede their productivity and thus their compensation. We find both of these hypotheses validated. So piece rate payment facilitates the implementation of compensation demands, sort of amplifying the effect, the improvement effect that we see there. And piece rate payment also exacerbates the trade-offs between compensation and OHS. The other organizational structure we look at is unionization. And so there we similarly hypothesize that unionization is going to be a facilitator of implementation of activists' compensation demands. This is because unions, even in settings where they lack a lot of political clout, they can play an important communication role, communicating workers' demands to supplier management, maybe informing management about demands that are occurring out there in the broader geographic region, and then helping management to engage with workers to implement changes. We hypothesize that unions are going to have a different effect than piece rate payment on trade-offs. We contend that unions play a role in monitoring occupational health and safety conditions and educating workers and managers about OHS issues. And we believe that workers and managers who have more information about OHS issues are more likely to resist attempts to degrade workplace safety measures. So here we have mixed findings. We do validate the first hypothesis that unionization seems to facilitate the implementation of workers' compensation demands, but we hypothesize this one in the wrong direction. And in fact, we find that unionization, just like piece rate payment, actually exacerbates OHS trade-offs rather than mitigating them. And I mean, we just don't have the data to dig into this further. You could interpret this in a number of ways, right? I mean, on the one hand, you could say this is evidence of unions' weakness and inability to stand up for workers and to resist trade-offs to other worker priorities. Or you might say, well, if what wages and compensation, better compensation is what workers really want, maybe unions are being really effective, right, in getting workers what they want. So anyways, that's kind of a lingering puzzle for us. But in any event, I will stop there. Those are our findings. I look forward to your thoughts and reactions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jodi. I was just going to interrupt you and say you're out of time, but you stopped right there. So our next presentation is actually going to be video streamed by Greg. So it's all yours.
I was gonna say, let me know if the sound's not coming through, okay?
Hello, thank you for allowing me to present my paper, Media Portrayals of Post-Rana Plaza Safety Initiatives, Perspectives from Consumption and Production Societies. This paper is by myself, Erin Leitheiser, as well as my co-authors, Jette, Steen, Knudsen, and Jeremy Moon. So first, where we start, this paper looks at different forms of collaborative governance with a focus on those governance initiatives seeking to fill governance gaps and managing supply chain risks. We see collaborative governance as a form of CSR, so seek to contribute to that literature. CSR is often used as a mechanism for legitimacy and is often deployed in international supply chains. And overall, these efforts are positioned as normatively good, both in the academic literature as well as in consumption market societies. Yet, different governance initiatives also vary in legitimacy. As many studies have shown, some efforts are seen primarily to mitigate buyers' risks or ensure compliance with their standards, rather than advancing the rights and working environments of the workers that they're supposedly designed to help. Further, we know that many suppliers view such regulation as simply an added cost. So the gap we see in the literature is that we currently don't have good studies that investigate both buyer and supplier sides of governance at the same time to be able to make this apples to apples comparison. Second, few studies look at a temporal investigation of governance initiatives, which can help to reflect the dynamic nature of governance and perceptions as they change over time, as governance changes over time. And finally, there are very few studies which compare private governance initiatives with public governance and regulation. So methodologically, we use the case of governance initiatives instituted after the crisis of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. We use the Accord and the Alliance, both international private governance initiatives, as well as a collection of domestic regulatory initiatives. These include the National Tripartite Plan of Action, the Remediation Coordination Cell, and the RMG Sustainability Council. And collectively, we refer to these as domestic public. So to look at these, we use the media. We see the media as a barometer for legitimacy in production and consumption societies, or otherwise called home and host environments. So media both shapes and reflects public attitudes, and we analyze media coverage across three measures. The first is prominence, the volume of coverage and its relevance. The second is valence, whether the portrayal or evaluation is positive or negative. And finally, the themes. So what types of topics or issues are being covered when governance is spoken about? So the paper uses a variety of sources from the global north and the global south, or home and host, consumption or production. And these were chosen to balance geographical origin and political bias. In the production market in Bangladesh, we use some of the largest and most respected papers, one in English and the other in Bengali. So on to the findings. So first, looking at prominence, which is the orange graph here. So while it's perhaps unsurprising that local media gave more coverage to the governance initiatives happening around them, what is interesting is when we start to look as to when they received coverage. Consumption market media focused on the initiatives quite early on, immediately after the crisis, and really looking as a response of the international brands when these private governance initiatives were being established. Then attention tapered off over time with very, very little coverage on the end of governance or transition out, or the impacts of these. In contrast, production market media paid very little attention to governance as it was established, but then had lots of coverage while the governance initiatives were in full swing of implementation, what we refer to as the operationalization phase. Second, looking at themes, which is the graph in blue, markets paid attention to different aspects of governance. Consumption markets focused on responsibility issues and the relative merits of different approaches to governance, while production market media focused much more clearly on implementation issues and the overall impact of governance. So all told, consumption markets paid great attention to input legitimacy factors, while production markets really looked mostly at output aspects of legitimacy. Onto valence, which you see in red here. The different markets also evaluated or portrayed the themes that they did cover rather differently. On almost every measure, consumption market media was far more positive than production market media. And it's also worth noting that much of the negative coverage in international media, in consumption societies that was negative, was really a criticism of one of the initiatives in comparison to the other, rather than an outright criticism of governance itself. And then finally, in green, we see the overall portrayal and see that consumption markets perceive governance much more positively than do production societies. So what does this all mean? So first, this really calls into question prevailing assumptions about consensus-based governance. The second is that it shows the dynamic nature of governance over time and how attention changes in different aspects of governance. So voices in Bangladesh hardly raised any sort of opposition at the beginning for fear of losing business, but then were very, very critical of governance once it was underway and being implemented. Finally, it also demonstrates the differing aspects of attention, with consumption markets focused primarily on principles and input legitimacy factors, while the production society was primarily concerned with practicalities and output factors. So this is still a bit of a work in progress, and we would very much welcome your thoughts and feedback. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks for Greg's masterful playing on his media player, but thanks to the authors for sort of really recording that in time, well within time. So that gives us a little more leeway for discussion. But let's go to Mark for the third presentation.
Great, thank you, Sarosh, and also my thanks to Greg and Kelly again. Just really fantastic job organizing these panels. So it's good to see everyone in Zoom. Next year in person, right? Okay, so here's some. Let me try my screen share, see if I have luck with this. Is that showing in presenter mode, or that's okay? Yeah, good, Sarosh? Okay, great. So 3 labor governance mechanisms for addressing decent work deficits in global supply chains. This, I should say, this is a version of an article that we published in a forthcoming special issue of the International Labor Review, Labor Governance and the Future of Work in the Era of Global Value Chains Disruptions, edited by Gary Jarefi and postwoman Ariana Rossi, who I think is on this call, so that's great. But more beyond that, I want to say this. This paper, in fact, is my first go at putting some ideas down for, and I say this with hesitation, but on my next book project. I'll be starting my sabbatical, postponed due to COVID. My sabbatical starts on July 1, so any and all feedback would be very helpful. Okay, so the idea for this inspiration. I'm really bringing together 2 things to get to this project. One is based on a paper I did in 2015 on labor control and worker resistance in global supply chains. And there I was really arguing, you'll see that depending on what form of labor control you have, worker resistance varies. And the second is a paper done by Jarefi and Lee in 2016 on why governance matters. So I pull those together, and I'm starting with this idea of control and resistance, but not stopping at resistance, which is what I did in 2015, and saying what's actually the governance outcome of that resistance. And another way to think of this is I think of when I was studying social movements back, I was like Cornell grad student, this idea that social movements come and go, and the question is what institutions they leave in their wake. So in this case, I'm looking at what governance mechanisms are left in the wake of worker mobilization in supply chains, with a focus, but not exclusively, on the apparel sector. So this was that paper 2015. I looked at 3 cases, all garments. Vietnam, I argued there was state labor control. Bangladesh, despotic labor market control. So state markets, and Honduras, repressive employer labor control. And I argued this led to 3 patterns of worker resistance and leverage: wildcat strikes in Vietnam, local mobilizing combined with international pressure and symbolic power, part of the media pressure Erin was referring to, and in Honduras, local organizing and transnational campaign. So that's sort of what I took that paper. So Jaffe and Lee come up with their paper in 2016, and they organize different types of governance mechanisms, first by categories, and they put out 3 categories: social governance, public governance, and private governance. And then they go from those 3 categories into 6 trajectories for social upgrading, their language. So from social governance, we get multi-stakeholder programs and labor-centered initiatives, labor trade unions mostly. Public governance basically gives us a public governance trajectory. Private governance, they divide into 3 forms: the market-driven, so basically supply and demand, different market dynamics, or the market correct itself. CSR, exclusively, sort of corporate social responsibility, not multi-stakeholder, and clustered center. This would be sort of local business associations in producer countries. So building on that, what I'm arguing is we get 3 mechanisms, trajectories for decent work in global supply chains that I'm sort of taking the Jaffe-Lee language and giving them my own categories. So for the multi-stakeholder, I want to focus on what I'm now calling global binding agreements. These are multi-actor binding agreements, and this is deliberately building on the language of global framework agreements, the global binding agreements. The labor center approach, I'm referring to encompassing collective bargaining, and public governance, the state, I'm looking at labor law, labor relations reform, and social protection. I'm also suggesting that these private governance mechanisms are less effective trajectories for significant and sustained decent work because they are unable to address power asymmetries. And just for one note, having Sarosh chairing, if you have any doubts about the CSR-driven path, please read Sarosh's latest book on this, and that'll be clarified. So the weaknesses in these approaches, their inability for significant and sustained decent work. So I'm going to focus on those 3. So going back to my original paper where I had these forms of labor control and patterns of worker resistance, and now we add governance outcomes. It is from the Vietnam case where these wildcat strikes, we add to that leverage through free trade agreements, we get social protection and labor law reform, and I'll explain more about that. In the Bangladesh case, we get these global binding agreements. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about the Accord, also the Alliance, the Accord being more binding on the buyers as opposed to just the suppliers. And lastly, it's in Honduras where we get these encompassing collective bargaining agreements. So this really is the focus of the paper. And again, the ideas, these become chapters in my next book project. So just to, I'm gonna see this a little bit better here. Just to break this down, these 3 different mechanisms, state reform in Vietnam, what do we see there? Well, first we see there was a really significant wildcat strike wave, which I studied, and Greg referred to earlier my work on Vietnam. What we start to see are minimum wage increases at the government level. They start to be more proactive, and they're attempting to stay ahead of inflation, and really more importantly, to stay ahead of the strikes, because that was the main issue motivating those strikes. So you get the state change in how it implements minimum wage rules in response to that form of resistance. You also see a reversal of pension reforms following very massive strikes in some very, very large factories. And lastly, and this, it comes through trade leverage, but it's also started with EU, but it also started with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this push towards worker representative organizations. This is a big question mark in Vietnam, but it is the first time since the Vietnamese Revolution that there's a acceptance of worker organizations outside the sort of party state sanctioned official union. So these are pretty significant reforms. In practice, certainly the minimum wage and the pension, yet to be seen, the worker representative organizations. For the global binding agreements, again, I'm using deliberately GBAs versus GFAs, taking framework and putting in binding. So they're like global framework agreements, but they're binding. They're multi-MNC, you know, the Accord had 218 buyers, but they're also multi-union and NGO. So also very different in that regard from a traditional global framework agreement. So the Accord had Industrial, Uni Global, WRC Clean Clothes Campaign, and others. There's other examples, and we could touch on those if we have time. Lastly, encompassing collective bargaining agreement. We see this starting in Honduras with Fruit of the Loom. It begins with the framework agreement that allows for neutrality. The unions start to grow throughout the corporation, and we get this sort of coordinated enterprise bargaining. And it goes from Fruit of the Loom to Haynes to Gildan, and it's going to others. It's a very interesting process right now involving Nike and its local supplier there, which is massive. And we see over this 10-year period going from something like 500 workers being organized to 50,000. So quite significant. So what are some of the takeaways given the time limitations? The main point, of course, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We have to figure out the starting point for each of these country cases. It's going to depend on the form of state, market, or employer control. It's going to depend on patterns of resistance. It's going to depend on what are the most pressing needs. And this gets back to the form of control. Is the most pressing need labor state reform? You can't talk about collective bargaining as the solution if you don't have unions that are independent from the state. That would be the first step. Is it building safety? Is it freedom of association rights, which motivated the protest in Honduras? And fourthly, this question of worker trade union strategies and ideas for addressing those needs. This question of ideas, this question of how do we think through responses? So this is, you know, not a mechanical response. The market dictates the outcome, but it's very much about strategies, interactions, and ideas. I just have a couple seconds. Let me just put up one more slide that just to say where I'm thinking of. I want to, in the book project, bring in shadow cases. So the 3 cases I mentioned would be the core cases, but I want to, with Vietnam, think of another sort of one-party state, but maybe get into cotton, the Uyghur region. With Honduras, garments, I want to think of bananas in Guatemala, which I've already researched. A little unsure with Bangladesh what I want to do there when some of these other binding agreements, but that would be the idea. And this would let me get out of just here, in this case, for the shadow cases, I would go beyond the garment global supply chains and either get to other segments of the supply chain or into other sectors altogether. So I'll stop there. And thank you.
Okay, that was great, Mark. Thank you. We have enough time, so I'm going to hand this over to Greg, who's our key discussant, and then we will open it up for questions.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, Mark, just reacting quickly to that last slide, it'd be interesting to think about where something like the Fair Food Program fits into that framework you're developing there. Well, it was a pleasure to read these papers and be your discussant. I'll be, I'll mostly give like the, I don't know, there's limited praise and there's a lot of like, here's what I think you should do. Here's how you should improve this. That doesn't mean I didn't really like the papers. It just meant 10 minutes. All right, so let me start. Actually, I rearranged this. I think I should start with Mark's because you just heard it. So one of the things I really appreciate about this is that it's, it points out problems and then it says, but like, here's 3 things that I think work. And I'm going to show you how they work and the different conditions underlying how they work. And so reading it's actually a very kind of empowering paper as far as, how you feel about the opportunities to improve working conditions and supply chains afterwards. So I have 2 thoughts. My first thought is, there's moments in this, I know it's, you have a very compelling argument about the sourcing and price squeezes. And I also think broadly our conversation about sourcing practices, in the last 5 years has kind of hit a fever pitch, or it's become almost like the central focus of all our discussions about all the things that go wrong for employees in global supply chains. And I want to put some like boundaries around that, moral panic about sourcing practices. Like, I don't think we can blame sourcing practices for many governments' hostility to worker organizations. This isn't a huge focal point of the paper, but there's moments where it implies this. And I think that for single party regimes like Vietnam and China, they just don't like independent organizations of any stripe whatsoever. And, that could be like church groups or trade unions and It's exacerbated by the relationship between the capitalists in that host country and the political authorities, but also just has to do with political stability in those countries. And the thought experiment I always do is let's imagine like the buyers kind of did everything we wanted them to do around sourcing and even gave like a bigger profit margin to their suppliers. You know, in some contexts, it might be the case that workers can bargain over that surplus and access it. But like in a lot of these production contexts, if you purely leave it to like what local authorities would do, I don't think there's a mechanism for really sharing that surplus with the workforce. So it might be a necessary condition to create that additional surplus through better purchasing practices. But at the same time, it's not clear to me that that's the prime cause of the conditions of employment in a lot of these locales. So I think it might be useful to remind readers, maybe this is for the book, that as far as worker organizing goes, the challenges really go far beyond the set of squeeze arguments. And my second idea was to maybe go and theorize a little more the supply chain part of each story. And even if you think about your summary slide there, each of your success stories is enabled by the presence of a global supply chain or an export market that represents some opportunity that then successful resistance or sometimes consumer side activism successfully threatens and generates the leverage for these changes. And so in Vietnam, it's TPP falls down, but it's still FTAs that are the leverage for the reform, and you end up with these worker representative organizations coming into play in 2021. In the Accord, there's this broad, widespread concern about the future of its truly only export industry that drives this. And in Honduras, you have the US campus activists, so destination market buyer side, that are threatening fruit of the loom and creating all this positive process. And so I could see in the book project developing a kind of, doing the same kind of like different situational analysis that you apply to the kinds of resistance that happens and like the responses of governments to the transnational part of the story. So thanks for a chance to talk about that. Okay, next one. Breakout and Toffel, another great paper that's bringing together a bunch of things that I'm really excited about. We have labor compliance and global supply chains. We have the kind of politics, social movement side of things, private politics. And oh, by the way, it's in China, my favorite country in the world. Okay, so I have three ideas for this paper. And my first idea is about the piece rate argument. So the argument around piece rate is that it's this corporate action structure. There's this redeployment of resources that's made easier in the context of a piece rate that would allow factories to respond to pressure from workers to more easily remedy, maybe lower cost remedy wage violations. I'd really like this paper to get into how does the piece rate really enable this? And I was starting to think through things, the common kinds of wage violations you see in China. One thing is like, do they actually pay the overtime wage premium? So 1.5 times. That seems way easier to fix in an hourly wage factory than it is in a piece rate wage faculty. I mean, you literally just, you kick in the multiplier once the payroll system goes above the threshold for overtime. Whereas in piece rate, it's much more complicated because you have to back out from the pieces and the time worked, how much to tweak things. At the very least, it doesn't seem any harder to do it in this other system. And so I think having some sort of anecdotal kind of like face validity things where you think through the real mechanisms under which this would actually function. Because this was the part that just from personal experience it didn't resonate with me, I would say, in the current version. And the second one is that, if you think about the chain of events, that's leading towards these compliance changes, there's like collective action in the broader community in the labor pool. And then something happens in the factory, presumably to address those wage-related demands and the activism. And so it might be useful, I know you have 40 different wage violations, to drill down a little bit and identify the ones that actually would be addressed by raising workers' wages, because typically workers aren't just asking for compliance, they like they want their wage to be actually higher. My second thought is about aligning the industries. So, the supply chain audits are all about manufacturers, but most wage-related collective actions in China aren't in manufacturing. Manufacturing is the modal case, but there's 58% of the cases in the data are about other industries. And the labor pools that manufacturers draw upon in China are pretty different from the labor pools for the construction industry. Like if you go to a construction site, it will be typically like 98% male. It's a different age profile. When you go into like light manufacturing industries, many more women in that setting. Transportation logistics, taxi drivers strike a lot. They're not the same labor pool as factory workers. And so I would suggest focusing on the manufacturing incidents, considering that we already have this kind of, from stuff in the community to these specific employers. I think if you focus more on the collective action that's most directly relative to those employers, I think that will be more credible. And my third suggestion is about continuous interaction effects. So there's this great paper in 2019 called How Much Should We Trust Multiplicative Interaction Models or something like that. I can send this one along. And they basically illustrate that like the kinds of plots that you show with your linear interactions, they go through a bunch of political science papers where everyone has to disclose their data. And they show that like, on the right-hand side of this plot here, this is what it shows in the paper, but when you look at the actual data, the data is all clustered on the left-hand side of that plot. It's non-linear, so like there's not actually a linear relationship between the three groups, and then it's way over extrapolated beyond the common base of support. And so I think it would be worthwhile taking a look at that paper and revisiting those interaction effects, because you have continuous, and there's just all kinds of opportunities to violate that assumption of linearity in there. Okay, last paper, the Leitheiser, Knudsen, and Moon media portrayals paper. And I feel as a discussant, I don't have as many like specific kind of ideas for this one. I really enjoyed reading it and thinking about both sort of the media portrayals on both sides of things. I think my thought is about whether some of what you find is just related to the nature of what's news and what would be news in these two different contexts. And when I was looking at this change in the sort of differences in coverage, so the gray bar here is basically the US or other, the UK or EU, and the black bars are coverage in Bangladesh. And the consumption markets are focused on the receptiveness to these initiatives and the relative merits of the accord versus the alliance. Bangladesh, much more interested in actual implementation and the impact on the manufacturers. I wonder if we can just understand this around the idea that media, what's newsworthy are like failures, tragedies, crises, and conflicts. And that the boring and completely crucial work of like risk mitigation, like making sure nothing happens in a factory, is completely boring and tedious, and no one really wants to read about it. So what they want to read about are like fights between, H&M versus Nike, right? H&M versus Gap, let's say. What they want to read about, so that's on the consumption side. And on the production side, probably what people want to read about are these like onerous demands from buyers that aren't consistent with local conditions, or like failure to follow through on promises. And so I kind of wondered if the varying distribution across the markets had to do with where conflict is located and what becomes a newsworthy story. Okay, those are my discussion comments. Thanks again for the chance to read these, and I'll shoot you these slides in case they're helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to ask the paper writers if you want to respond to any of these comments, and if so, can you respond to them pretty quickly or briefly so that we can open it up to questions? So I will ask Mark first.
No, nothing significant. I think Greg was very helpful. I think you're right. I need to play it up more. I mean, the idea of these three forms of control are not about the sourcing practices. It's state control in Vietnam, in Honduras. I really get into some of the sort of real brutal forms of employer control and repression, and the conditions in Bangladesh. But I think that's important. Of course, the question I always think of too is, why did the buyers choose the countries they went to, and how has that changed over time? And one of the papers I did, I think it's Squeezing Worker Rights, there were really two paths. One was you increasingly sourced from a labor repressive regime. So let's say in relative terms, you leave the Dominican Republic and you increase sourcing to China. The other is you stay in a country, Honduras, and respect for labor rights in that country goes down over time. But those are, I think, two different ways to get there. But your point is well taken, and I will look at that as I revise. Thank you.
Jodi?
I just want to thank Greg for the comments. Were really helpful, and we'll dig into those. But just looking forward to hearing others' comments.
And is Erin, she's not here, but Jette, do you want to respond to anything that Greg said?
Well, thank you, Greg. I think your point is really good about what's newsworthy, the focus on conflicts, of different types of conflicts in host and home countries. Nonetheless, I do think that there's value in looking at how legitimacy is being shaped at a broader societal level, rather than, as in a lot of the literature that looks at the organizational level. So that would be my quick comment to you. But I think it's definitely a good point that we'll need to think about as we take this forward. As Erin said in her presentation, this is very early work. And I think where we're going to go forward with this now is focusing on the legitimacy aspect as the key focus of the paper.
Okay, thank you, guys. The floor is open for questions, and here's the way: if you can use the hand function, you know, under the reactions column at the bottom of your Zoom, then if there are many hands, then I will start calling the hands who are up. I'm also monitoring the chat. If you prefer to sort of use the chat to ask you questions. Yeah, question from Jodi.
Yeah, sure. I have a question for Jette and Erin. I was wondering if you were able to differentiate different types of negative reactions coming from Bangladesh. So I guess what I mean by that is there has been, when you talk about valence, right? I took your valence variable to be measuring negative reactions to private governance, to kind of to suggest that maybe private governance isn't stringent enough, it's not rigorous enough. But some of the negative reactions to the accord in Bangladesh was because it was too stringent, right? There was actually like a negative reaction welling up because it was actually thought to be working too well in some quarters. So I was just wondering if your coding system captures that complexity.
Yes, it does. I can't speak to it in detail, but we have a coder in Bangladesh, or we have actually a team of coders who've been looking at different aspects of positive valence and different aspects of negative valence. So that would be part of the paper. I think that's a very good point you made. So, and we have way more coding than we have actually yet been able to analyze, but we will be including that.
Floor is open. Chanyeol.
Thanks for the great presentations. I have a question for Jodi. I think especially regarding the question about the union effect. I think perhaps like coming from an industrial relations perspective, Chinese unions are very difficult to to have any functional effect in Chinese factories. So I'm wondering perhaps if the paper is under review, do you get any questions about the union question? Like, why do Chinese union matter? Because the big question in China for China is that the unions are mostly paper unions, or they do not help the workers. So I'm wondering about the union question. And another question concerns about the cost of these different wage improvements or OSHA improvements. Was it because the increase in wage, like the compensation, sometimes lower or higher? Like if it is lower, then the improvement in OSHA, like say you have to have the good air, good temperature, a different ventilation system, a wholly different workplace situation. Then the argument is that they are implementing the low cost, like increasing a little bit wages, and then they are avoiding the higher cost. So the alternative argument for their implementation, resource reconfiguration, not different, but a different slice to that.
So do you want to respond, Jodi?
Sure. I just briefly. I think it's a good suggestion. Yeah, I mean, building on Greg's suggestion to look at variations in different types of compliance, not only in wages but in OHS. So that's another thing we can dig into. But on the union, I guess I would just say that we have a very modest understanding of what unions can do in these factories. And we certainly don't make any contentions that they're applying political pressure to the suppliers. But we think that there is sufficient research out there suggesting that at a minimum, unions in these factories can just serve as kind of a communication conduit. So we view them just kind of in this modest way as an organizational structure that can facilitate, in this paper, we talk about them as facilitators of resource reconfigurations, right? So I guess I would just, I mean, you may disagree with that function as well, but we do have a very modest understanding of the role that unions play in this setting.
Okay, so there is a question on the chat first. This is from Anil, and it's addressed to all of you. So at least the two papers that involve governance. And could they respond to the question? Is a governance challenge in integrating across the national or local with the international parties? Does anybody want to respond to that?
I could jump in first, Sarosh. Then thanks, Anil, for that question. Let me start with Honduras. If you ask me in a normative way, what do I think is the most promising case? Honduras is interesting because it's really founded in the bargaining. So the local union, if you will, bargaining as a local governance. The state, at least you wanted the Honduran state to be permissive of that bargaining, and it does that. What's interesting during COVID is those unions that built up first Fruit of the Loom and then the two other companies, they become strong and they bargain with the state during COVID for wage relief support. And that has spillover effects for the entire industry. So if I'm not mistaken, employers were to pay 1/3 of the wages and the state would compensate with the difference of 2/3. That spilled over from what started from local governance, local, if you will, at the enterprise level. And it goes up to the state level. So you have the state coming at that level. It starts, as I mentioned, with after the union was blocked originally at the factory back those 10 years ago, it goes to the transnational level with this bargaining between unions, worker rights NGOs, and Fruit of the Loom. So you have this transnational framework agreement. So the three really fit together. You see the three all presence, and the strongest aspect is at the local level. The other two cases is more complicated. Vietnam, it's impossible. You might have worker representative organizations now as of January 1. You don't have permission to do international campaigning if you're a worker. It's just blocked. That's one way you could be detained. So there's and Bangladesh, you have very, very active mobilized unions, but there's a lot of fragmentation, which has and thresholds for bargaining that's made bargaining part weaker. So the Accord or the Alliance, these other initiatives sort of play a stronger role. So again, depending on the context, which of those three levels has a stronger role to play will vary. That helps.
Okay. Jette has a hand up, so it's all yours.
Thank you. This is a question for Jodi. I really enjoyed the presentation. This looks like one of these, another great paper from you and your co-authors that we'll be all focusing on in the future. But this question about, as I understood your paper, when occupational safety and health goes down, it correlates with productivity increases, you argued. So I was wondering, if I understood that correctly, first of all, and I think I did, then is there a time dimension here that's not included? Because, for example, in Bangladesh, after Rana Plaza, a lot of factories, when they were meeting the Accord and Alliance requirements, it meant that those factories actually rebuilt or at least moved outside, many of them outside of Dhaka. So there was a link between meeting these requirements for structural building safety that actually was linked to higher productivity, and that there was a better organization. The factory was bigger. A lot of initiatives that linked occupational health and safety to productivity increases. So I'm just wondering if over time proper implementation of occupational safety and health would not be correlated with productivity gains as well, or if there's a way of including a time dimension for that argument, because it's quite a strong argument to make that OSH, sort of a decline in OSH is correlated with productivity increases and vice versa.
Well, so we have no data on productivity, and it would be really interesting to add that to the mix. Our data is exclusively on compliance with wages and hours standards in codes of conduct versus compliance with OHS standards. And so, I mean, it's a much more modest claim that we're making. We don't know whether or not OHS is correlated with productivity in our factories.
All right. Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood that. So thanks. Thanks, Jodi.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Any more questions? Great.
I was just going to say one reason I didn't, give you a hard time about unions in China. I totally agree with Chunyan. We're talking about this in the chat, but every time we look at these employers in China, the unionized ones keep paying higher wages, and no one can understand why, because they don't really collectively bargain and they're not really representative. And so it's like this. It's like at this point like a 10-year puzzle that anyway we haven't really figured out. I see Chunyan nodding, so just wanted to throw that in there.
We still have 3 minutes. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Rose.
No, I've been in and out. I apologize. I've tried to follow the papers. And I would just say that I'm really enthusiastic about the ways in which this network of people, researchers, continues to expand the terrain, both theoretically and in terms of kind of subject areas. From what I saw in the first round when we collected papers that eventually led to your special issue last August. And I think the more incorporation of the state and of other institutions interacting with the union, et cetera, is a really promising kind of extension of the work you all have been doing. And as I said at the beginning of, I think, the last session, I'm very enthusiastic about developing a series of published papers in the review so that we can either do small clusters or move them through as they become available. And so that we develop a series of papers on global supply chains over time and really become a kind of go-to place for this kind of research. So I just really applaud all of you and hope I wish I was doing it. I used to be an international researcher, but now I'm just focused on the damn Wall Street financial crooks and what they're doing to the rest of the world. So I would much rather be out in the field hanging out with more interesting people than that. So keep up the great work.
Okay, great. So, that's the great way to end the session. So, we have no excuse. The editor of the Best Industrial Relations Journal has just told you that she's willing to look at manuscripts, right? So we should take advantage of that. With that, I'm closing the session, and we'll see you at the third one shortly.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, Sarosh. That was great.
So when's the next one? It's at 3:15, right?
3:15. Yep. Got 75 minutes to chill out.
Go get lunch.
Yeah. See everyone soon.
So the last thing went off really well. The last session. I mean, I meant the other thing.
Oh, great. Good.
I was going to ask you to give me a toolkit, then I said, forget it. I mean, I made a little bit of my own.
Okay.
There was a big conflict between not a conflict, there was a big difference between the brands and the others. And the brands were the ones who were eating this up. They were really taking notes, both in your session and mine, was taking all the notes. And, clearly they are junior people going back into their, whereas the others are all senior people like the Dutch people.
they're jaded. Is that the difference? The idealists and the jaded ones?
No. I think that the Dutch minister was the one who really loved it. I mean, she was the one who kept telling us, look, this is great research. Now this, supports this, it supports that. So yeah, so it went well.
Oh, great. That's good. All right. I'll see you in a little bit. Have a good lunch.
I'm just going to close this.
Yeah.
Hey, Bernadette or Emily, can you guys hear me? Or are you engaged in another thing? Okay, let me check.